So hello and welcome to another conversation on the cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I am very happy to have as guest Michael Arbib. Michael Arbib's pioneering contributions to brain theory and artificial intelligence have had an extensive interdisciplinary outreach. His current research has two themes. One, developed in how the brain got language, links biological and cultural evolution. The other combines the cognitive neuroscience of the design and experience of architecture with study of buildings with brains, whose design is informed by neuroethology. When Brains Meet Buildings, a conversation between neuroscience and architecture, will be published by Oxford University Press in mid-2021. Michael, we are very glad to have you here, and I am very, very curious about your presentation. I already took a look at the slides, but I'm especially curious to see what challenging ideas you are going to bring to us today.
Okay, well, I have a confusing, what is it? A challenging thing. Let's first see if I can meet the challenge of sharing a screen. So it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
It should be able now.
Okay. All right. Okay, screen 2. Share. All right. Are you seeing screen 2 yet? I can't.
We can see your presentation. There's an image with a house and a tree.
Okay, yes. So this is just to say it's spring in California, in La Jolla, and to wish all of you in the Northern Hemisphere a delightful spring.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Now, okay. So what I want to do is my contribution to this really great series. I've enjoyed every lecture so far and hope that this will be enjoyable for both of us, as it were. I want to pick up on this word phenomenology. So I think a lot of people in this arena talk about the first person experience, the embodied experience of the world. And of course, that cuts both ways. If your design, you want to give a good experience to the user, but you inform that with your own experience. Now, what I want to do is develop the idea that with neuroscience, we can, in some sense, dissect the phenomenology. Different parts of the brain make different contributions. How can we begin to understand that? And for those of you who are not familiar, this is the famous solstice at the Salk Institute, when people gather with ANFA to observe the brain setting over the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so a riff on, most of you aren't old enough for this to make any sense, but JFK in his inaugural address made this famous claim, ask not what your country can do for you. And my riff on that for today is ask not only what neuroscience can do for architecture or design, which I think is the major theme here in this series, but also what architecture can do for neuroscience. In other words, my hope is that by thinking about moving out of the lab and into the external world, including the built environment, neuroscientists and cognitive scientists can learn new things. By the way, this is the cover of the book that should be out in a few months. And I was walking down Unter den Linden in Berlin one day and looked down a side street, and there was this amazing installation of a man staring into the upper story of the Collegium Hungaricum. And only after I'd chosen the title for the book did I realize that, wow, this would be very good for a brain meeting the building. Okay, so this little Venn diagram says that if you're just looking at behavior and experience, and what you want to do is to understand the underlying processes. So we're moving in from the phonology of behavior and experience and saying, what's going on in the head? And if we just go at that level, we're into cognitive science, psychology, psychophysics. But if we say, well, how can we relate information on the brain, whether it's the human brain or what we learn from the circuitry in animal brains, then we get to neuroscience. And my claim is going to be that cognitive neuroscience can enrich phenomenology. So let's just step back a bit. It's clear that great architecture has been created by architects who had remarkable intuitions about the effect of buildings on human experience and behavior, but knew nothing about the brain as such. So the claim is not that you must know about the brain to do great architecture or great design, but the claim rather is that there are lessons to be learned from cognitive neuroscience and this two-way conversation. I think it's very interesting that two people who I would regard as a high priest and a high priestess of the phenomenological and experiential and embodied approach to architecture, Sarah Robinson, who we had the pleasure of hearing from recently, talking about her book Architecture as a Verb, and Juhani Balasmar, I'll talk about his work later. Not only have they published on their phenomenological view, but they were also co-editors of what is still considered by many to be one of the best collections for thinking about neuroscience, along with embodiment and the future of design. So my claim is going to be then that brains certainly exist. We do need to understand them, whether it's only to enrich our understanding of ourselves or to think about human minds and bodies in social interaction and in the environment, whether built or not, and turn that into insights that might affect our approach to the design of architecture. All right, so let me start immediately with a prime example of the way in which we can dissect phenomenology through the brain. Many of you perhaps have enjoyed one or more books by Oliver Sacks, and so you're familiar with this theme of neuropsychology, that we can find unfortunate people who have suffered different types of brain damage. One famous book was titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. So this particular case, actually, this is an observation that originally goes back to around 1900, that people who have damage to this area of the brain, in what's called the parietal cortex, they may, depending on the nature of that damage, lose half their body. And by losing half their body, I mean if they're dressing, they'll pull on a shirt, cover one half their body, and leave the other half uncovered. And if the nurse says, Mr. Smith, why aren't you putting on the shirt on that arm? He says, well, I don't know whose arm it is. Maybe the surgeon put it there as a joke. Hard to believe. What's worth adding, though, is that Bisiak and Luzzati, 1978, interviewed people with hemi-neglect who were in Milano, and he asked them, imagine, so this is not now saying you're dealing with your body, imagine the space around your body, memory, describe what you would see around you if you were staring at the Duomo. And as this cartoon shows, they'll describe very well what's on the right-hand side of the place. Now, the amazing thing, though, is that they haven't forgotten the other side. Now you tell them, turn around and imagine the Duomo is behind you and describe what you would have seen, and they'll describe everything there. So this idea of that half the body and half the world can disappear, that phenomenologically you might think, well, the integrity of the body, the integrity of the world around us and how we experience them. No, here's a dramatic case where a brain lesion can destroy that integrity. So that's my slogan, Dissecting Phenomenology. And so just to skip to the blue, our first person being in the world rides atop a vast diversity of neural processes. And if we're in the cognitive science mode, we're not looking at the actual processes in actual brain regions, but we're saying here are different things that contribute to our interaction with the world. So I'm going to say then neuroscience can dissect phenomenology by showing how first-person experiences arise from melding diverse conscious and subconscious processes. And then the claim is that that's going to enrich the self-reflection of architects. And in particular, the architect may well think about how people with different brains at some typological level might require different adaptations in the way you design buildings of different architectural typologies. And I think Eduardo Macaque is going to say something along the theme when he looks not so much at brain damage as much as emphasizing the life course, the lifespan architecture and what changes during that period. Okay. The other thing I want to emphasize is that I'm not just talking about experience in the way of looking at a building and saying how beautiful it is. It's what we call the action perception cycle. You perceive something and that determines how you will act. You act and that changes what you'll perceive. And all that depends on your current motivations, your current goals, and so on. So architects design spaces, we visit them and contemplate them, but we see, touch, feel, and respond emotionally to various aspects of them, and we use them. We act within and around them. And so we're, in some sense, combining multimodal experience within this action perception cycle, and we're serving both, as it were, the contemplative needs of the users of the building, but also a lot of practical needs. If you design a house and you forget a crucial aspect of embodiment and don't put in a bathroom, then you fail to provide a vital set of needs. I just want to pick up on Prietti and Gepstein, who mainly emphasized visual performance, visual perception, talking about proportions of static forms, and they're setting up of a very interesting set of experiments. But what I noticed in the discussion was they came up with this term from van der Laan, who was the inspiration for Tiziana, who incidentally was a Dominican, I believe, priest. And so he talked about the liturgy of performance. And the example that I think Sergei gave us was the influence of spacing of columns on the speed of locomotion. So that in the end, we're not just looking at static snapshots and how do we appreciate them, we're looking at the way in which we experience change in the world, whether it is just giving us our experience of, oh, this is a great space to move in, or whether it's meeting our practical needs. And so in relation to practical needs, as you all know by now, that the big term that we owe to J.J. Gibson is the idea of an affordance. And the idea here is that you, as you look at the world, you don't just see objects, you see opportunities for action. And I just want to take a moment. This is a view some of you will recognize of Las Ramblas in Barcelona. And I think just about all of you will have had your gaze snapped pretty quickly to the woman in yellow in the middle there. And so that's sort of a bottom-up effect of visual perception. Certain things jump out at you and attract your attention. But what Gibson talked about was something called optic flow. And he studied during World War II people landing airplanes. And what he was saying that, yeah, of course, you've got to know where the runway is and orient the plane to be going down towards the runway. But the actual leveling out to make a smooth landing does not depend on that object perception, that conscious perception. It's the way in which the pattern is flowing across your retina. And you can use that to estimate the time until contact, and that will change the way you adjust. And similarly, as you're walking down here, you may suddenly move to the left or the right because your peripheral vision picked up the optic flow saying there's a collision coming. And you may not even recognize that person. On the other hand, if you want to go to the metro, you may be searching for a metro sign, and then to the left in the middle, you'll see an M, and you'll go and inspect that on the basis of a conscious thing to see whether in fact that has anything to do with the metro, or it's an initial for some artistic exhibition or otherwise. So that's the important point of affordances. They're both conscious and subconscious. And the other point I want to make is this notion that some of, I think, Shaw and Turvey, disciples of Gibson, came up with a little later, of effectivity. So an affordance for action depends on your ability to carry out that action. So the example here would be, suppose I'm about to collide with somebody. If I were a bird, which I'm not, I would fly up and fly over the person. But that's not part of my effectivity. So to say there's an affordance for avoiding a collision by flying is pretty meaningless. I mean, interestingly, as a human, I can imagine that, but I can't, it's not an affordance for me. It's a different part of my ability. And maybe that's not uninteresting. And maybe that ties again to what Eduardo will talk about, because as a designer, you're not always designing for yourself, you're designing for others. And so your ability to imagine what their effectivities are, and thus to design what affordances you can provide for them in the object you're designing, may be a crucial part of the design process. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to race through this because I've said most of it. Let me just go to the top 2 bullet points. So if a door is designed for use by the general public, then it should be designed to offer prominent visual cues to aid the user's decision. You want it to be seen by visitors to the area, that this is a doorway for them. But if you're designing, let's say, a restaurant and there's a doorway that's only for staff, then you might want to make that inconspicuous so that only the staff will think about going through it. But then the other point is, that's the conscious stuff. How do you design to make affordances visible or in other ways affordable? And the complement to that is, what are you doing subconsciously to match the affordance to the effectivities? So determining the tread in a flight of stairs would be one example of catering for the subconscious, or ensuring that a doorway will be wide enough. If you're building making a public building and you expect a certain crowd level, then you want to make sure people can pass through, and you're providing affordances then without really thinking about the person saying, oh, that's wide enough for 3 of us to go through. Okay, one other note. This is a slide just to remind you that some people, particularly Tonino Grafero, have talked about the atmosphere of a building as an affordance. And this is just to establish that it's not a Gibsonian affordance. It's not something that talks about your practical action rather than your action or your motion. It's an affordance for entering an emotional state or a mood. It's trying to get you to enter that state. So both the practical Gibsonian affordances and the emotive, moody, atmospheric affordances are relevant, but I'm not going to talk about that. There's a whole chapter 4 in the book. The book I'm showing at right is one of 3 booklets from workshops that Johanni Ballasmaa organized with the Tapio Verkala Rootbrook Foundation. The first one was with Johanni, Harry Mulgrave, and myself on architecture and neuroscience, this one architecture and atmosphere, and one more with people like Vittorio Gallesi, and Harry Mulgrave again was on architecture and empathy. So if you can get hold of those 3, I would recommend that. Okay, now the next concept I want to introduce, as you can see, I'm not trying to drill down, as some of my colleagues have done in earlier lectures, into the specifics of bringing a particular notion to bear on one aspect. I want to give you a framework in which to think more generally about this idea of how neuroscience and cognitive science can dissect the phenomenology, which can inform the way we design. So the notion I want to come here is scripts. This is a notion that came up in artificial intelligence and in psychology, cognitive psychology, around the 1970s. And it's the idea that it's a general framework for a variety of related behaviors. And what's important is that it doesn't tell you, here is the script as if you were the actor in a play. This is what you must say next. Now you must move stage right, etc., etc. It's rather a very general set of constraints. So a good example is the birthday party script. Okay, there should be a cake, there should be presents. You should probably light the candles before the guest of honor blows them out, etc., etc. But within that, there's a huge flexibility. And let me just give you one more example that I like, is that you go to the doctor and you're greeted by the receptionist and they say, how are you today? And you say, oh, I'm fine, thank you. And you're in the greetings script. And then you go into the doctor and she says, how are you today? Oh, doctor, I have these terrible pains. You're in the doctor patient script. So I think this is very interesting. And the notion then is that buildings support scripts. That doesn't mean they force you to behave in a particular way. You can explore, you can do new things, you can vary the script. But still, if you're designing a building for a particular purpose, if you're designing a restaurant, there's a script. You better have a place where people can get a table assigned, a place where they can sit. If it's a fast food restaurant, the script is going to be very different from a fancy restaurant for an evening with candles and wine and so on. So that script is an important part of the way you design. And I just want to pick up a nice example. This is some of you will recognize the São Paulo Art Museum, designed by Lina Bobardi, who is Italian but spent most of her life in Brazil. And the first thing I want you to notice is the unconventionality of the design. It's sort of like a suspension bridge, the building suspended from the 2 red supports. The other thing is, if we're talking about Gibson and optic flow, you can see the challenge of getting across the Avenida here. And then if you look at the building itself, you'll see that it defies a normal script for a big public building. Where's the entrance? Where's that flight of stairs leading up to the grand entrance that welcomes you to this important building? If you look carefully, you'll see at the far end, there's a stairway and some elevators. And so you have this, she decided, okay, I'm not going to do the same thing. I'm going to create this space underneath the building, which will be a public space. And so the entrance is going to be quite discreet. And then if you go upstairs and visit the gallery itself, you find to your amazement, instead of the usual script, which is the the pictures lined up against the wall, and you proceed in a sort of one-dimensional trajectory down a wall at a time, choosing what to stare and look at, and you look to the side of it to see the inscription here. They're mounted on glass plates, which are held in these big cement blocks. So you're seeing them in a two-dimensional pattern. If you want to find out what the painting is about, you have to go around the back to see the details. And so here we've got changing the script, but tying back to that notion of atmosphere again, in the art gallery, we're emphasizing that the actions, the important actions, are often the contemplative actions. It's modulated by atmosphere as well as our prior and ongoing mental states. But what I want to stress then in conclusion is that Bardi rewrites almost all the standard scripts. But I won't read the bullets because we've been through that, but you can still deploy your general knowledge of public buildings and of viewing points to master her new scripts, and thus appreciate the art in the building. And perhaps that's part of, again, a good design. It's not, oh, this is the way they always do it. But on the other hand, it's not so confusing. I can't appreciate or make use of the building. So these are the sort of ideas I want to give you with this crucial notion of script. Okay, now back to Johanni Ballasmaa. A very important book for me was The Thinking Hand, Existential and Embodied Wisdom in Architecture. And here are just 3 bullet points that I pull out to give you some sense of the message of the book. It also has a sort of hymn to the wonders of using the human hand to sketch as part of the design process, but that's a separate topic from today's. So the knowledge and skills of traditional societies reside directly in the senses and muscles. Human consciousness is an embodied consciousness. The hand is crucial. Now, from my point of view, I say, well, you know, if you've just got senses and muscles and no brain in between, that hand is a dead hand. The hand doesn't think by itself. It has to have a brain. So yes, the thinking hand. So in fact, my first public talk on architecture outside Southern California was a response to a talk by Johanni, in which I developed this theme of, yes, but what about the brain? And so I think many of you have by now heard this hymn to embodied cognition. And I think, for example, Sarah in her talk, really the brain didn't matter very much. It was the body in relation to the world. And I want to emphasize that our approach to action-oriented perception cannot succeed unless that body is animated by a brain of suitable complexity that has been shaped by relevant experience. Put an aardvark brain in my head, and for better or worse, you wouldn't be getting this talk. And the experience I could tell you about in my aardvark way would be very different from what I can tell you in my human way. So to give another buzz frame that I think might be worth remembering, we've all heard about embodied cognition, but it has to be combined with embrained cognition. And we're looking at brains in bodies in the social built and natural environment. And it's only that totality that lets us understand what we're doing in design. Okay, so I want to quickly go through a little neuroscience. I see I'm running out of time. So I think what I'll do is just tell you these slides exist. Those of you who have access to the handout can read an exposition. But so here's a...
Sorry, Michael, we can continue in the discussion to develop this topic a little further, because I would like to pick it up from here.
Okay, sorry, please, can I just show the pictures?
Yeah.
Just 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Okay, because these are topics I need to get into the discussion. Please,
yeah,
Maria.
Sure.
Thank you.
We will return here.
So this is just a study showing that the hand pre-shapes as it moves, but also goes quickly as shown by the dots, and then slowly. This is a cognitive level representation of all the different schemas, perceptual schemas and motor schemas that must come together. Here is the basis for another dissection of phenomenology, where we find that how you do actions and what you do in carrying out the action involve different pathways in the brain. Here's the fact that you can learn from animal studies on getting a handle on actual circuitry within the brain of the monkey that you believe can carry over into what you can learn from brain imaging in the human. This is a computational model we developed. And the last topic is the notion of the body schema. And this ties back to the notion of neglect we started with. Head and Holmes, way back in 1911, introduced the body schema as anything which participates in the conscious movement of our bodies is added to the model of ourselves. So tools are incorporated into the body. And here is just another discussion of the way in which our affordances, effectivities change if we have tools. And the final point is that I want you to think of the building as a set of tools for living, an inside-out robot. And so I close with this slogan, out from the body and in from the building. And to think about that, I think, offers something deep to pursue and understand better. The idea that our embodiment requires the brain on the inside, it requires tools on the outside of the body, but the way we use those tools is shaped by our environment, and architecture can in some sense create a building that has its own schemas, if you will, that influence our behavior. I hope that was quick enough, Maria. I did what I could.
Yes, thank you. And we will continue exactly. I will pick up on this thread. Could you please just stop sharing your screen so that we can go to...
Yeah, I will try. I don't know how to get rid of it.
I can also do it.
Oh, here. Okay, great. Thank you.
The host seems to have some perks.
Wonderful.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation, Michael. I think there are so many interesting ideas that we can discuss, and I would really like to pick up with two threads that I think are very interconnected in the way that you approach your vision also as a neuroscientist of what architecture and design can be. So I would like to start with this connection between this idea of the scripts in connection with affordances and effectivities, specifically this topic of the body schema. So in your paper, the paper that you gave to us, you mentioned this example of also in connection to tools, and now you just mentioned of architectural space as a kind of inside-out robot. This complex machine with different machines inside that we can use to extend our bodies. And I think this is a really interesting perspective because it also shows we can see it through the reversed process, how we as humans, very vulnerable in our environment, also evolved our brains through the capacity of creating tools. And this was a two-way process. So from this need and also from shaping and creating the tools, we, so to say, shaped and developed the brain as we have nowadays. And one can see also architecture as a manifestation of it. What I would like to ask you is that in how far do you think that this connection between the tools we use and the scripts we perform can be liberating in this sense that we are extending our capacities and improving our conditions, but can also be restrictive since we somehow are responsible for the tools we shape and the results of our actions with these tools in the environment. So I would like you to make a comment on this.
Yeah, okay, so to take one example, most of us, perhaps all of us, live in houses or apartments with running water. We have a kitchen area and a bathroom area where we can go to get a drink of water anytime we want it. We don't have to get a bucket and walk over to the spring and fill it up, or to the river and bring it back. So in a way, it's a pity to lose that daily walk to the spring. But once we've reached population densities like ours, it's liberating to not be fighting over the one spring that runs through the middle of the town. On the other hand, we are now currently at the end, we hope, of a massive experiment where we have used technology to replace human proximity. And so I think most of us would agree that a creation of embodied community where we actually get together in person and can give hugs and can break bread and have a glass of wine with people in person is of value. And so a technology which took us all the way to the fact that we could only interact with other human beings in this fashion we're doing now would be negative. So I think that just gives you the sense that you have to balance these things. I just spent yesterday on a Zoom call with a group of people thinking about the future of artificial intelligence, and it would blow your mind, but that's a topic for another day.
Well, you could bring us some information, because we have also been discussing this topic. I recurrently bring it to our discussions because of the influence that we know that algorithms have, not just in the way we interact, but in the future they will have more and more also in the way we build. And especially if we consider the prospect of smart cities, that we will have progressively engineered homes with permanent access to all sorts of information, and also all the scripts we will be performing at home will be monitored and registered through Internet of Things. So I personally become more and more aware and also this topic, naked in the sun, that's the topic of the exercise our students are currently working on, is also a way to deal with this idea that in the future architecture is going to shelter us, but in how far do we also need to shelter ourselves from this exposure that architecture actually is inducing in us. So I would like also to talk maybe a little bit about this.
Forgive me, but I would like to say you've just summarized it very well. There is, I can send you the announcement. Davide Ruzon in Venice is hosting a get-together in Milano on the 29th of this month, which will be explicitly on the topic of AI and architecture. So if you'll forgive me, I'd like to invite you to come to that.
I would love to.
All right.
Okay, so maybe we can bring another topic, because I am still fascinated by your concept of scripts for two reasons. Because in many ways this overlaps a lot with one idea that I have been exploring with my work. Although I don't call it scripts, I call it protocol. Our protocols of interaction. And in performance art, you probably know from history of art that performance art, especially in the 50s with the influence of the situationists, it was a kind of program of performance art to really deconstruct these protocols of using the city, using the home, and rewriting these scripts as a way to rewrite political narratives, so to say, that can be expressed in private space, in public space, and so on. And I find it really interesting that you always bring this example of the building of Linabo Bardi exactly as a manifest object that very playfully deals with this idea of the script and of the protocol, and how a building, by inviting us to perform actions in an opposite way or questioning the protocol, can be a way to make a societal change, so to say, because from the moment we go through those experiences, we are also transformed. We see other possibilities of addressing a specific situation through space and interaction, social interaction. So how did you start developing this concept of scripts?
Well, in the 1960s and 70s, I was reading work on artificial intelligence in its early days on related work in cognitive psychology. So I came upon a book called Frames of Mind by Marvin Minsky, who is one of the founders of artificial intelligence. And he used the term frame. And then Schank and Abelson, Schank, an AI person, doing language, and Abelson, a cognitive psychologist, put out a book on scripts and behavior. And Irving Goffman, a sociologist, put out a book on sociology and frame. So the sort of greeting frame versus doctor frame is the sort of thing he was talking about. So this is something that's been part of my vocabulary for the last 50 years. And the experience of going to Sao Paulo and experiencing this building, fortunately, for many years, they had been using the space conventionally, hanging the pictures in the normal way. And I had the good luck to be there after they'd restored Bardi's way of showing the material. And so it just struck me that here there were scripts you need. If you're going to an art gallery, goddamn it, you've got to get to the pictures and see them. But she had, as you say, playfully changed those scripts. And again, the point goes, in any building, there's going to be a balance. If you're designing a hospital, on the one hand, you've got to be able to get the patient as quickly as possible to where they're going to be given the care they need. On the other hand, in a children's hospital, you're worried about the atmosphere. How do you make the kid happy as possible by decorating the environment? One nice observation, we went to a hospital locally a while ago, and the patient we were with had to fast for 12 hours before arriving. And the guy who was guiding us to where the medical procedure would take place observed that a nice feature of the lobby was that there was a Starbucks there, but it was unfortunate in the sense that these poor people who'd been starving for 12 hours had this wonderful aroma of coffee taunting them as they were coming in. So I think that idea, a building is going to have multiple scripts, some of which are very explicit. There's a need to be matched here. Let's provide it. And you play the script in different ways. You're designing a school. In the end, there's got to be a place where the teacher can get the materials and show them to the kids. There's got to be a place where the kids can sit. But just how you do it changes. And we've seen these dramatic exercises now in adapting the classroom script to the needs induced by COVID. But whenever you're designing a building, my claim is that you're going to have uses in mind. There are going to be people coming in, they're going to use the building in a certain way. And then as the architect, you're going to have to think of the scripts. And as we've seen, you can either think of, okay, I'm designing another McDonald's. Okay, I'm going to change the height of the ceiling and the arrangement of the seating. But basically, anybody who goes into a McDonald's expects the same script. I'm designing a high-end restaurant. There'd better be value added in terms of the novelty of the architecture. So although it meets all the needs, the waiters have got to get the food to your table while it's still hot, and so on. Nonetheless, there's going to be perhaps a more playful or a more contemplative element that complements the thing. So I still find the script very valuable as an organizing concept, while using the Bardi to say that the script doesn't constrain you. And I use the birthday script example to remind ourselves that, hey, if you're arranging a birthday party, you can do almost anything. But if you don't have a cake and some candles, then maybe, well, depending on your culture at least, but in the cultures I've been in, people are going to be disappointed. So that's the sort of picture of scripts from 1974 to 2021.
It has a lot of interesting concepts, yes, and I find it interesting that you mentioned it that it's an idea from the 70s, and because the 70s also saw a very big boom in performance art. So, for example, in the work of Marina Abramovic and Joseph Beuys, and so who really directly influenced my work, their whole work was really focused exactly on subversing all these scripts. So perhaps it was something that appeared exactly at this particular time, and that still has a lot of potential for today. And speaking of subverting scripts, I also find really interesting that in your work, because usually when we hear about neuroscience and architecture, we hear a lot about the concept of wayfinding, which of course is very relevant, but you always come up with this challenging idea, which I think is very personal, of the concept of way losing as a way of explore, not being lost, but exploring potentialities of in the environment. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Actually, I thought I'd invented the word and then was frustrated to find that there was a Dutchman who'd invented the word before I did. What was interesting is we both came up with the same example, namely Venice. And that I first visited Venice when I was a teenager, and I just loved the way I got lost. You come down to a canal and there would be no bridge, and you'd look to your left and there'd be a bridge over there, and you'd go back into the alleys and you'd come out, and then now the bridge was down that way. But you were seeing all these interesting buildings and the canals and so on. And so that was a case of an environment where it wasn't designed so that people would lose their way. It was designed to create a city on a lagoon with its canals. But that seems to me that and then the other example that Mollerup used in the same quote was that, on the other hand, if you're designing a hospital, you don't want people to lose their way and to have to explore to find the emergency room, right? That has to be available. But that idea of, okay, and so going back to wayfinding, what's very interesting now, and one of the things that came up in yesterday's AI discussion, is the idea we build a map of our world, a cognitive map. We have an appreciation of where things are and roughly how far apart they are. And we don't know all the details, but at least it allows us to navigate around the house or get to the shops or get to the airport or what have you. But now people drive and they use a Google map and they don't have a clue, right? They're saying, oh, I'll turn left when I'm told, I'm turn right when I'm told, and I trust Google to get me there. And now you're not using the hippocampus, sort of the organ of wayfinding. You're just using affordances. You're told the next affordance you will exploit is turn left at the light. The next affordance you will exploit is turn right at the fork, and so on. So I have a chapter in the book, or a section in the book, called something about the hippocampus, wayfinding with and without the hippocampus, which contrasts these two styles. If you've built your own cognitive map and you use that to make your own navigation versus the idea. And then the other point about a cognitive map is it's not fixed routes. So you can detour with the cognitive map, but you can also explore with the cognitive map. You can say, okay, I haven't been down that street before. I don't know where it goes, but it looks interesting. Let me go down there. And then you're into the way losing mode, not in the sense of being lost. So one has to be careful with the word. It's not getting lost mode. It's intentionally losing your way in the service of exploration.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned this, with having now these affordances that are given by the navigators and so, because more and more we are being somehow pushed to always make use of these affordances because it's the most optimal, the most efficient, the quickest, the best. So we can rely. And in how far can this make us a little bit stupid, because we are not using our hippocampus as we should. We actually evolved with the brain we have, which is wonderful, because we had so many challenges. So what's going to happen in the long run if we continue to rely so much on so much help?
Well, a lot depends on what help you want. I mean, if I were put in the middle of a forest and told that it would take me at least 2 days to get to the edge of the forest and back to civilization, and I had to support myself for those 2 days, I probably wouldn't make it. But as someone who reads books and writes books and Zooms with people, I'm doing pretty well. So I think it's a real question of what do we need. Now, one of the interesting examples of this, I think, is the movement for eco-architecture, the idea that you don't just build urban spaces. I mean, obviously the people who put out the great parks in London and New York and elsewhere already knew this. You had to have parks. You couldn't just have urban buildings. And so the idea that people need green space, and then now the issue is, can you bring that green space into the design of every building, not just putting parks every few blocks and so on. So this is a case of saying there seems to be a human need there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in respect of this experiment we have conducted on ourselves for the last year or so, the idea that Zoom is good, right? It allows us to create community, when we can't do it in person, but having that in-person ability, and therefore designing a world in which we can meet people and interact with them. And then just to go back to way losing, in some sense, way losing in person space, right? Meeting strangers sometimes is a good thing. All right, you don't want to meet somebody who's going to attack you, but if you've got somebody who can share new experiences with you, that's good. And so on. So I think all of us try to balance off in our lives, given the environments available to us, exploration and having things we can rely on. I changed internet provider recently, and for a day I couldn't get to the internet. Oh my God, I was totally deprived. But
you
so
also be free from the machine for some time.
Yeah, well, there were things I wanted to do in the machine. I managed. I actually have books. You remember books? These things.
They're my favorite things.
What many people don't know is that it's an acronym. BOOK. It stands for Basic Organization of Knowledge.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And it's not true, but never mind.
It was a nice game we played here. We could go on forever, but because we don't have too much time, I would now give it to the audience to make 1 or 2 questions, please. And to our students, yeah.
Yes, I have a question. So first of all, thank you so much for your interesting talk. I was inspired. I want to pick up the script you were talking about, and I'm asking myself, shall we seek for universal scripts? Because you were mentioning the scene at the doctor's office, for example. You greet people, and for example, when I stayed in the US, they don't expect you to say, no, I'm bad, or I'm not good right now, I'm sad, I don't know. In Germany, for example, it's kind of, you can do that, you don't, but it's kind of like in the society, you can talk with random people about something like that, but you wouldn't do that in the US, for example, at least from my perception. However, I ask myself, or should we seek for those universal scripts in architecture or just in general? So every user can understand everyone. Otherwise, we would obviously have a lack of personality. Yes. So what is your thoughts about this question?
Well, when I travel, I like to have a hotel with running water, and I can take a shower and use the bathroom in other ways. But on the other hand, when I go out, I want to see both classics of recent architecture. So I go to Brasilia and I see what Niemeyer has come up with. But also, I want to see, I walk around Rio and I see traditional buildings of the 19th century, which are different from other 19th century buildings I know. Or I go to Japan and I ride on the Shinkansen, the high-speed train, and I admire that. But then I go and visit a pagoda or a temple. And then maybe I'm interested to see a modern building which shows the influence of that culture. So no, I think the idea of specific cultures, I mean, I appreciate the fact that all of you are talking with me in English. But I think the world would be a sorry place if you didn't have your German and your Portuguese and your Italian. And I just read an interesting book by a woman named Mizumura, a Japanese novelist, who the book was called something like The Death of Japanese in the Age of English. And she is lamenting the fact that with the rise of English and the change of the Japanese characters, now Japanese only learn a fraction of the kanji, the Chinese characters they used to know. And so the literature from pre-war becomes inaccessible. And you can translate, but we all know that translation is wonderful, but you lose things as well, the shape of the words and things of this kind. So no, I think we want, again, way losing in culture as well as elsewhere. We want certain things. If I travel, I'd like to be able to figure out how to get from A to B. Mm-hmm. But when I travel, I want to see things that I couldn't see anywhere else. And that can be nature too, right? I don't think, we should say, okay, Niagara Falls is the standard waterfall, and only waterfalls that look like Niagara, but maybe you can make them bigger or smaller if you wish. Okay, I'm being silly, but you get my point. Is I think that it's a price we pay that we don't want all the same script. On the other hand, we have to say who is going to use this. It's a bit like saying everybody should go to a Christian church. No more synagogues, no more temples, no more mosques. There's variety, but if you look at the modern world, you'll see there's some amazing church architecture and mosque architecture, which breaks the spell. Now, you still got to have the minaret if you're building a mosque, but almost anything else is up for grabs, and that's good.
Okay, thank you so much.
More questions?
Or answers, that's good. Golly.
Michael, I have a question.
Thank you.
In some ways, it's partly a game, but it's also an interesting approach, is to conceptualize the anti-script. In other words, the script sort of creates itself for a particular location, right? You've been to Venice many times. The scripts are kind of existent. And now you decide that exploration requires an anti-script. How do you create it?
Well, in thinking about the cognitive map, one of the ideas that I have is I conceptualize it as a graph where the nodes are places you know, and the edges are how do you get from one place you know to another place you know. And then exploration is sort of the decision that you're going to reach a place you know and then say, okay, the edge leads that way, I'm going to go that way. And then the decision as to whether you go that way may depend on just, hey, that street looks interesting, let me see what's at the end of it. Or alternatively, of course, you may say to somebody who knows the town, what's an interesting area to explore? Or I hear there's a great pagoda, where is it? And then you can either say, well, give me a Google map and I will do every little intersection to get there. Or you may say, no, I'll have much more fun if I just head off in the general direction and get lost a little bit, but see the area. And eventually I'm going to stumble on it, but that's the way I'm going to do it. So that introducing some element of randomness but then it may be with very loose constraints or very tight constraints. It may go just from, oh, that looks interesting, let me see what's down there, to have some sort of general goal rather than a specific goal, and I explore in the service of that goal. Will that do? Or?
Yeah, no, I was thinking that, going back to something you talked about, before, which is action perception, and we tend to create our scripts so that there is some smoothness, some connectivity, some thread, and then we keep repeating those. Not if you go visit Venice, perhaps every once in a while, but in our lives, right? And so I think it's important to think about taking the sequence through life in different ways, because the sequence of experiences in different orders, or with different heights and things sticking out, gives you a whole repertoire of things that you might not have considered. It's like going to a library and going through one of the stacks all the time, and then all of a sudden you're on a different stack. All of a sudden you're seeing books you hadn't seen before. So I guess way losing or way knowing, which is another way people talk about this, is a way to really purposely change experience and therefore build connections between things that are not,
Let's pick up on your example. So we're saying that there's sort of a meta script of how do you find your way around a town, and then you apply that to Venice, even though there are canals and bridges rather than roadways. And you can either get from the concierge, how do I find my way to Piazza San Marco? Or you can say, I'm going to explore today. Or I'll take the ferry and the Vaporetto, and I'll get off at some random stop and see what happens.
Yeah, or you go
But
to
in
the
your,
to go around the other way. Yeah.
but in your other example, I have a general script for how do I find books in the stacks of a library. And then there I make the decision that instead of going to the usual place with the Dewey Decimal numbers I've been told in the catalog, I'm going to pick an aisle at random and just see what books they have there, and maybe I'll find one. Or even in the aisle I usually go to, instead of going to where the book I want is, I may stop and say, oh, what books are nearby? I mean, that's one of the delights of going to the stacks rather than going online, is you can find books nearby in physical space rather than nearby in information space. So,
Yes.
so I think there's still, even when you lose your way, you have some overall goal and some meta script that is engaged.
Yes, and what I'm getting at is that to some extent, affordances, you can get used to affordances and use the same ones all the time, but you can reveal new affordances by being exploratory.
Oh, we do. I mean, each new tool, we learn the affordance of using that tool, right?
Okay, and that's where you use your brain the most, perhaps.
Or even sometimes, and this is what I like to do with my students, those who went through this process of working with me already know, which is to explore hidden affordances of objects by repurposing them and using them, transforming it into something else, or even pulling them apart and reassembling these parts with parts of others to create another one. And my whole idea with this, or goal with this way of working, is that if we are used to, in some ways, lose our constraints to what we already perceive as affordances, our range of perceiving affordances becomes much richer because it's endless.
Which is good and bad, right? But no, I agree. We can, and when we go to a foreign country, there are objects with affordances that we do not know, that they're cultural ones. So you can both find new affordances by making your own exploration with the object or the space and doing new things there, or you can be in a new culture where people use objects in different ways. I mean, if you grow up in a Western culture and somebody puts two sticks on the table, what are the affordances? Once you've had any experience of Chinese or Japanese or other food, you know they're chopsticks. And then there's a very complicated set of effectivities, which takes people a long time, hours or days to master, to be able to use those for picking up food. So yeah, I agree with you. But what I'm trying to say here is that objects as such don't have affordances. It's only objects in relation to people within cultures that have affordances. And so you may discover new affordances and you may lose affordances. So somebody who gets confined to a wheelchair, a flight of stairs no longer offers affordances for getting to the next floor, right? So you're saying there's a joy in exploring new affordances. I'm just adding that there's a cultural overlay of what the affordances are may be known within one culture and not another. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless object. And that as you change, you may gain new abilities, new effectivities, or you may lose effectivities, and that's going to change you. But I very much like your idea of the fact that you can learn new things about objects. You can gain new effectivities and affordances.
Or even understand them better. That's also one of the goals of these exercises. For example, some years ago, I did this exploration with the topic of chairs and tables. And me and the students, we all became much more aware of exactly what a chair is as an object, how it relates to our body, and also the meaning of the object chair and its role in our rituals in daily life.
And that's why you're chairwoman for this conversation.
That's one of the reasons.
Yes.
So we will have to end our session for now. But if there would be just one small question or one small commentary for the end, I would still like to invite you. Okay.
Like, I don't really
Thank
have
you
a
very much.
question.
It was fun.
I don't really have a question, but I also wanted to thank you for this very interesting overview of your work and other works. And I think it's very, like, I'm still trying to process like all the other talks also and this talk, but what I really find really interesting is how to incorporate all these new things I'm learning in my designing process. Or I hope the others maybe have this too, but I think it's like, for me, this all is like really, really new. And it's really interesting, and I'm always like thinking a lot about like in what kind of step of designing like cities or a building or whatever I'm designing. I'm like really interested in how I now in the future can incorporate these things. So thanks a lot for giving us an insight in all this very interesting work you do.
Yeah, and just in conclusion, I'd love to get email from any of you who'd like to pursue some of these issues further, arbib@usc.edu. So please keep in touch.
Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for participating, and especially again to thank Michael Arbib for having been here today and for contributing with his talk and this conversation for the Cycle of Conversations, and for being here every week, also contributing with comments and questions. So, okay, I think we can end for now. Thank you very much for being here.
Can I say something?
Yes, just in a few moments.
Oh.
Because we need to make a short break until the next session.
Oh, okay. I thought we were starting at 6.
No, we had an adjustment because of the time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But the good thing is that you will be able to catch it on YouTube tomorrow, and then you can write to Michael whatever questions you would like to.
I'm so sorry I missed it.
So
thank you, Sarah.
Sorry about that, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed it too. I didn't see that there was an earlier, I thought we were just logging on now. So sorry, I didn't know that.
No, I sent it in the last email for the ENFA network to pay attention to the time shift.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see it.
So, but you can catch the talk on YouTube. I will upload it later today, and then you can contact Michael Arbib directly if you would like to continue the conversation. Okay. So thank you, and thank you, Michael, once again, and we see us in a few moments. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.